Day 7. 7:42 p.m., October 17th, 1941. Lance Corporal Frank Kopp opened his eyes in the ice-cold mire of a Soviet forest, south of Vyazma. His body trembled uncontrollably. 7 days, 7 nights, behind enemy lines, alone. He reached for his Kar 98K rifle, feeling the familiar metal. Then he fumbled for his ammunition pouch. His fingers counted slowly, mechanically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 20 rounds. That was all that stood between him and death. 20 pieces of brass and lead against an entire Soviet army. In that moment, with mud-caked hands and a gaunt body, Frank Kopp knew something with absolute certainty. Every single one of those 20 rounds had to count, or he would never see his comrades again. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories like this, subscribe now. It costs nothing and helps immensely. Let's get back to the story. September 23rd, 1941. The offensive of Army Group Center was rolling relentlessly towards Moscow. The Fourth Army, under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, breached Soviet defense lines with the precision of German lightning war tactics. Lance Corporal Frank Kopp, 27 years old, a carpenter from a small town in Bavaria, served as a sniper in the 7th Company of the 487th Infantry Regiment. His file recorded 43 confirmed kills since the start of Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd. Frank was no hero, as he often told his comrades. He was a craftsman who had learned to work with precision. As a carpenter, he measured twice and cut once. As a sniper, he breathed twice and squeezed once. This discipline had kept him alive. While thousands around him fell, the Fourth Army had just encircled the city of Vyazma, a strategically critical position on the road to Moscow. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in what would later go down in history as the Battle of Vyazma and Bryansk, one of the largest encirclement battles of the entire war. But the Soviet commander, Ivan Konev, was no fool. He knew that his troops were surrounded, and he knew that desperate men resort to desperate measures. On October 10th, 1941, he ordered massive breakout attempts. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were to fight their way through the German lines. Costs and losses no longer mattered. It was pure desperation. Frank Kopp was in a forward observation post on October 10th, 3 kilometers east of the main line. His mission, to identify and eliminate enemy officer gatherings. With him were 4 comrades: Sergeant Hans Berger, Corporal William Schmidt, Rifleman Martin Hoffmann, and Medic Paul Dietrich. 5 men, a reaper position as they called it. They lay hidden in an elevated wooded area with a perfect view of the Soviet positions. Frank had already taken out 2 Soviet officers, one at 640 meters, a clean headshot, the other at 580 meters, chest shot. Both fell before they knew what happened. Then, at 2:23 p.m., all hell broke loose. The Soviets launched their desperate breakout attempt not at the expected point. They broke through right where Frank and his comrades were positioned. Later, German post-war analyses would show that over 40,000 Soviet soldiers attacked at that exact spot. 40,000 desperate men against a thin German line estimated at a maximum of 2,000 defenders, a ratio of 20-1. Frank heard them before he saw them. A rumbling, like an earthquake made of human voices. Hurrah, 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 the infamous Soviet battle cry. Then they came storming out of the woods, hundreds, no, thousands. A wave of field grey uniforms and steel helmets. Frank fired, hit, reloaded, fired, hit, again and again. Beside him, William Schmidt's MG-42 machine gun roared, 1,300 rounds per minute, a sound like fabric being torn apart. But there were too many, far too many. Sergeant Berger shouted the order, "Retreat immediately to the main line!" The 5 men jumped from their position and ran westward through the forest. Behind them, Soviet voices bellowed. Machine gun fire lashed through the trees. Martin Hoffman stumbled. A shot had hit his right leg. William Schmidt turned around, hoisted him up, but then a volley hit Schmidt's back. He fell, Hoffman with him. Frank turned around, saw his comrades on the ground. Saw Soviet soldiers only 50 meters away. Berger pulled him by the arm and said, "We can't help them. Run!" Paul Dietrich, the medic, cried as he ran. He had broken his oath. He had left the wounded behind. But there was no choice. The 3 men ran on. 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The forest grew denser, the Soviet voices quieter, but not silent. They were still there, everywhere. Frank, Berger, and Dietrich reached a small clearing. Berger pulled out a map. His finger trembled as he ran it over the crumpled paper. Berger said, "We've run too far east. The main line is northwest, at least 5 kilometers, maybe 7. And in between, there are now thousands of Soviets." Dietrich whispered, asking what they should do. Berger looked at Frank, then back to Dietrich. His voice was calm, but Frank heard the desperation in it. Berger explained, "We'll try to get through at night. Now we hide and pray." They found a fallen oak tree with a hollow trunk, large enough for 3 men. They crawled inside, pulled branches and foliage over the entrance. And then they waited. Silence, only interrupted by distant artillery fire and occasional volleys of gunfire. Frank checked his ammunition, 40 rounds in the magazine and in the pouch. Berger had his MP40 with 3 full magazines. Dietrich only had a pistol, a Walter P38 with 2 magazines. That was all. Against a Soviet army, the hours crawled by like years. At 9:37 p.m. they heard voices, Soviet voices, very close. Frank held his breath. Through a tiny gap in the foliage he saw boots, 5 pairs, 10, 20. An entire unit marched right past their hiding place. One of the Soviets stopped, only 3 meters away. Frank saw through the gap as the man lit a cigarette, the face briefly illuminated by the match. A young man, maybe 20 years old. With a mole on his cheek, the soldier smoked. 30 seconds, the longest 30 seconds in Frank Kopp's life. Then someone called out in Russian. The young soldier threw the cigarette away and marched on. Frank exhaled. Dietrich was shaking so hard, his equipment was clattering. Berger placed a hand on Dietrich's shoulder and urged him to be quiet, very quiet. They stayed in the hollow trunk until 2:15 a.m. Then Berger cautiously crawled out, scouting. Listening, he waved the others out and explained the plan. "We're moving now, silently, single file, 10 meters apart. If one of us is spotted, the others run. No looking back. Understood?" Frank and Dietrich nodded. They moved like ghosts through the night forest, every step deliberate, every sound avoided. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough light. That was good. Darkness was their friend. They made it 2.5 kilometers. Then they heard it again. Voices, many voices. Berger raised his fist and signaled them to stop. They took cover behind a cluster of trees. Ahead of them, only 100 meters away, was a Soviet field camp. At least 300 men, maybe more. Tents, fires, vehicles. And directly between them and the German lines, there was no way around it. The woods to the right were too open. To the left was a swamp. Berger whispered, suggesting, "We wait until dawn. Then we try to sneak past on the right." Frank looked at the sky. In 3 hours it would be dawn. He nodded. They retreated 100 meters and hid in dense undergrowth. Dietrich whispered that he was thirsty. Berger handed him his canteen, explaining, "Half full, we have to share." Frank didn't drink. He still had his own water, a 3/4 full canteen. He knew it could be a long time. The three men lay side by side in the bushes. The forest was filled with sounds, wind in the leaves, distant voices, the crunch of boots on frozen ground. At 4:47 a.m., dawn began to break. Berger gave the signal. They moved cautiously to the right of the Soviet camp. Every step was torture. Every cracking twig sounded like a gunshot in Frank's ears. They were 50 meters past the camp. 100 meters. 150 meters. Frank began to hope. Maybe they would make it. Maybe they would reach their lines. Maybe they would survive. Then Paul Dietrich stepped on a landmine. The explosion shattered the morning silence. Dietrich screamed, a short, agonized scream that cut off abruptly. Frank turned around, saw Dietrich's body on the ground. Both legs were gone, just gone. The Soviet camp exploded into activity, voices, shouting, orders. Berger roared, "Run!" Frank ran. Behind him, gunfire lashed through the forest. He heard Berger's MP-40 answer. Short, precise bursts of fire, covering fire. Frank ran 30 meters, then threw himself behind a tree, turned around. Berger was 20 meters behind him, running in a zigzag pattern. Behind Berger were at least 30 Soviet soldiers. Frank took aim, breathed, squeezed the trigger. A Soviet soldier fell, reloaded, aimed, fired. A second one fell. Berger reached Frank's position. His face was ashen. Frank asked about Dietrich. Berger shook his head, replying, "Dead. Before he hit the ground, God's mercy." They ran on. The Soviets followed. Frank could hear them, calling out coordinates to each other. Professional soldiers, not raw recruits. They were being hunted like animals in the forest. Berger and Frank ran for another 15 minutes. Then they reached a river, wide, maybe 30 meters, the water black and cold. Berger gasped, explaining, "We have to go through, no choice." They waded into the icy water. It was deeper than expected. After 10 meters, it reached Frank's chest. The weight of his equipment pulled him down. Berger next to him was struggling as well. Behind them, the first Soviet soldiers reached the bank. Shots, bullets struck the water. Frank ducked under, swam. 3 strokes, 4, 5. His lungs were burning. He surfaced, saw the other bank, 15 meters more. He swam on. Then he heard Berger scream. Frank turned around in the water, saw Berger. Blood was gushing from his neck. A shot had hit the carotid artery. Berger's eyes met Frank's eyes, and in that look was everything. Keep going, survive, tell our story. Then Berger sank into the black water, just gone. Frank wanted to go back, wanted to save his comrade. But more shots lashed around the water. He had no choice. He swam on, reached the other bank, pulled himself into the bushes, and ran, alone. For the first time since the beginning of this hell, Lance Corporal Frank Kopp was completely alone. No more comrades. Only him, his Kar 98K rifle, and 20 rounds of ammunition. That had been 7 days ago. Now, on the 7th day, in this cold mire. Frank counted his ammunition again. 20 rounds. He hadn't fired a single shot since the river. Every encounter had been avoided. Every Soviet troop circumvented. 7 days, 6 nights. He had only moved at night, hidden during the day, in hollow trees, in holes in the ground, under piles of leaves. Once, an entire Soviet company had camped directly above his hiding place. For 8 hours. Frank hadn't moved, hadn't coughed, had barely breathed. His water had run out on the 3rd day. Since then he had drunk from puddles and streams. Once he had licked rainwater from an overturned helmet. His last food had been on the 5th day, 3 raw potatoes, stolen from an abandoned Soviet field kitchen. His body ached, every muscle, every bone. His feet were softened by the wetness, blisters everywhere. One of them infected. He could feel it. But Frank Kopp was a carpenter. He wasn't a quitter. Back in small town in Bavaria, his master had taught him, work isn't finished until it's finished, no matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it gets. You stick with it, and Frank was sticking with it. He knew from his map that he was approximately 15 kilometers behind Soviet lines, maybe 20. In 7 days, he had covered perhaps 8 kilometers. Too slow, much too slow. But the woods were swarming with Soviet troops, everywhere, supply columns, patrols, artillery positions, field hospitals. He had seen it all, and avoided it all. On the second day, he had had a chance. A German reconnaissance patrol, only 300 meters away. He could have run to them, could have called out to them, but between him and them were Soviet MG-42 machine gun positions. He would have been killed in seconds, so he had watched as the patrol disappeared and had remained alone. On the fourth day, Frank had done something that had almost cost him his soul. He had passed a Soviet field hospital, wounded everywhere, groaning, screaming. The smell of blood. He had considered something, medicines, bandages, maybe even food. It was at night, darkness, only 2 guards. Frank had waited 20 minutes, observed, planned. Then he crept forward, soundlessly, like a ghost. He reached a tent and crawled inside. Within, 4 wounded Soviet soldiers lay, sleeping. One moaned in a fever dream. Frank ignored them. He found bandages and stuffed them into his rucksack. Then he found a can, maybe bread. He opened it, sardines. He ate them straight from the can, ravenously, quietly. Then he found something else. A dead Soviet soldier in the corner of the tent, freshly deceased, still warm, and this soldier wore a canteen on his belt. Frank took the canteen, opened it, smelled. Water. Clean water. He drank. 3 long draughts. Then he refilled his own canteen. As he turned to leave, one of the wounded Soviets opened his eyes, staring directly at Frank. Their gazes met. 3 seconds. 4, 5. The Soviet was young, maybe 19. His left arm was nothing but bandages, his face deathly pale. Frank's hand moved towards his pistol, but he didn't draw it. The young Soviet blinked slowly. Then, with infinite effort, he raised his right hand, not threatening, not pointing, a simple gesture. "Go. Get out of here. I didn't see you." Frank nodded once. Quietly in German, he whispered, "Danke." The Soviet didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. He nodded back and closed his eyes. Frank left the tent like a shadow in the night. Behind him remained a dying enemy soldier who could have fulfilled his duty, but had chosen humanity. Day 7, 7:42 p.m. Frank moved again, westward, always westward. The sun was setting. Soon darkness would shield his path. He had maybe 10 kilometers to German lines, maybe less, if luck was with him. But then something happened. He heard voices, many voices. German voices, Frank's heart hammered. Germans, his comrades, he was almost there. He cautiously crawled through the undergrowth towards the voices, reached the edge of a clearing, and saw German soldiers. About 30 men. His joy twisted into horror. The German soldiers were prisoners, hands behind their heads, surrounded by at least 50 Soviet guards. Frank watched, petrified. A Soviet officer walked along the line of prisoners, asking questions. One of the German soldiers didn't answer. The Soviet officer drew his pistol and shot the German in the head, just like that, in cold blood. The other German prisoners cried out. The Soviet officer shouted back in broken German, "Who doesn't answer dies! Next!" Frank clawed his fingers into the earth. His mind raced. He could do nothing. 30 comrades, but 50 enemies, and he only had 20 rounds. Even if he hit them all, which was impossible, there would still be 30 Soviets left. They would slaughter the prisoners, and him too. There was no way to help. But then something happened that changed everything. In the distance, from the west, artillery fire erupted. German artillery. Frank recognized the sound. 10.5 centimeters howitzers. The Soviet guards became nervous. The officer gave orders. The guards began to lead the German prisoners away. Eastward, deeper behind Soviet lines. Frank saw an opportunity. It was insane. Suicide, maybe. But it was the only chance. He would follow the convoy, wait for the right moment, and then he would strike. With 20 rounds, Frank Kopp would try to save 30 comrades, or die trying. Frank followed the prisoner convoy through the night, 50 meters distance, sometimes less when the forest offered cover. The Soviets were nervous. He could hear it. Their orders sounded sharp, hurried. The German artillery continued to thunder in the distance. That meant the front was moving, maybe a German counterattack, maybe a Soviet offensive. Frank didn't know, but he knew that chaos was his best weapon. The convoy marched for 2 hours. The German prisoners stumbled, some fell, were beaten by Soviet guards with rifle butts, forced back up, driven onward. Frank's rage grew with every step. These men were his brothers, not by blood, but by something stronger, by duty, by camaraderie, that German word that no other language can really translate, Kameradschaft, loyalty unto death. At 10:17 p.m. the convoy halted. A small clearing, a stream flowed through. The Soviet guards allowed the prisoners to drink. 5 minutes rest. Frank used the time. He crept closer. 30 meters, 20 meters. He could now recognize faces. Young faces, exhausted faces. A lance corporal, barely 18 years old, wept quietly. An older, non-commissioned officer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispered something. The boy nodded, stopped crying. Soldierly virtues, Frank thought. Even here, in the darkest hour, they stuck together. Frank counted the Soviet guards again. 50, no, 52. 2 had joined from the rear, 52 against 20 rounds. The math was devastating, but Frank was a sniper. He didn't need 50 shots. He just needed the right 20. A sniper doesn't shoot soldiers. He shoots command structures, officers, radio men, MG gunners, anyone whose death creates chaos. Frank identified his targets, the Soviet officer with the pistol, the lieutenant with the map, 3 sergeants with submachine guns, 2 radio men with radios, 4 MG gunners. If those 11 died, the Soviet command would collapse. The remaining guards were young recruits. Without leadership, they would flee or freeze. That's what Frank hoped. Praying was something he could no longer do. He had stopped praying 3 days ago. God seemed to have abandoned these woods. After the break, the Soviets drove the prisoners onward. Frank followed. He waited for the perfect moment. And in the 9th hour of the 8th day, fate granted him that moment. Current status, 500 subscribers, 16,000 hours of viewing time. If you want to watch regularly, subscribe now. Every subscription counts. Back to the story. The convoy reached a bottleneck, a steep slope on the left. Dense forest on the right. The column had to reduce to a single file. Frank saw the topography and realized this was his chance. The only one he would get. He sprinted through the forest, parallel to the column, 50 meters ahead, reached an elevated point. Perfect overview. The column would march directly beneath him. Frank opened his Kar 98K rifle, checked the magazine, 5 rounds in it. He had 3 more magazines in his ammunition pouch, each holding 5 rounds. 20 rounds in total. He chambered a round. He rested the Kar 98K rifle on a fallen log, a perfect rest. He took a deep breath, then another, and a third. His heart rate began to slow, a trick his instructor had taught him a year ago. Control your heartbeat, control your shot. The column began to march through the narrow passage. Frank waited. The Soviet officer came first, then the first prisoners, then the guards. Frank waited until half of them had passed through. Maximum confusion. Then, at 12:34 a.m. on October 18, 1941, Lance Corporal Frank Kopp squeezed the trigger. Shot one, the Soviet officer, 110 meters, headshot, dropped instantly. Shot two, the lieutenant with the map, 125 meters, a chest shot, fell backwards. Shot three, sergeant with the MP-40 submachine gun, 98 meters, a neck shot, fired into the air as he fell. That was good confusion. The Soviet guards froze, shouting incoherently. Where was the fire coming from? Shot four, second sergeant, 115 meters, headshot. Shot five, third sergeant, 103 meters, chest shot, magazine empty. Frank ejected it, reached for the second, reloaded, 3 seconds. The Soviets began firing wildly, but in all directions. They had no idea where Frank was. Shot six, first radio operator, 132 meters, back shot. The radio operator fell onto his radio, destroying it. Perfect. Shot seven, second radio operator, 119 meters, headshot, both radios out, no communication. Shot eight, first MG-42 machine gunner, 95 meters, chest shot. The MG-42 fell to the ground. Shot nine, second MG-42 gunner, 108 meters, gut shot, fell screaming. Shot 10, third MG-42 gunner, 127 meters, headshot, magazine empty, second magazine out, third in, reloaded. The Soviets were now in panic. 10 of their comrades dead in 30 seconds. Invisible death from the darkness, terror in its purest form. Some guards were running, simply running away into the woods. Others threw themselves to the ground, screaming. Frank had 10 rounds left. He used them with surgical precision. Shot 11, fourth MG-42 gunner, 112 meters, shot 12. A guard trying to shoot a German prisoner, 89 meters, shot 13. Another guard aiming at the German prisoners, 94 meters. The remaining Soviet guards were now fleeing, throwing away their weapons, running in all directions. Frank had 7 rounds left. He would not use them on fleeing men. That was not his way. He was a soldier, not an executioner. Frank stood up, shouting at the top of his lungs in German, "Kameraden, zu mir, Nordwest, schnell!" Comrades, to me, northwest, quickly! The German prisoners, 30 men, looked up the slope, saw Frank's silhouette in the dim moonlight. A moment of silence. Then the older NCO, the same one who had comforted the weeping private, roared, "Ihr habt gehört! Bewegt euch! Alle! Jetzt! You heard him! Move it! Everyone! Now!" The 30 German soldiers ran, picking up fallen Soviet weapons. Climbing the slope to Frank's position, Frank covered them, his Kar 98K rifle secured, finger on the trigger, ready for any Soviet soldier who would return. But none did. They had all fled. The first soldier reached Frank. The old NCO, Klaus Reinhardt, he stared at Frank, saw the ragged uniform, the gaunt face, the feverish eyes. The NCO asked how long Frank had been there. Frank's voice was hoarse. He replied, 8 days, behind the lines, alone. The NCO nodded slowly. Then, with military precision, he saluted. Frank returned the salute. The NCO asked for his name. Frank answered, "Lance Corporal Frank Kopp, 487th Infantry Regiment, 4th Army." The NCO introduced himself. Non-commissioned officer Klaus Reinhardt, 200 BPC 2nd Infantry Division. We were captured 4 days ago. They were taking us east, to a prison camp. Frank nodded and said, "Not anymore. We're going home." The 31 German soldiers moved through the night, westward, always westward. Frank led. He knew the way, had studied it for 8 days. Every tree, every stream, every hill. They marched for 4 hours, encountered 3 Soviet patrols. Each time they hid, each time successfully. Frank had 7 rounds left. He would only use them in an extreme emergency. At 4:45 a.m. on October 18, 1941, they heard something wonderful. German voices, not captured, free, calling out. Klaus Reinhardt wanted to shout. Frank held him back, urging caution. Could be an ambush. Frank crawled ahead, alone, scouting. He reached the edge of a clearing, saw German soldiers. A reconnaissance patrol. About 20 men, real German troops, with MG-42 positions, with radio antennas, with the Iron Cross on their uniforms. Frank stood up slowly, hands up, shouting, "Nicht schießen, Deutsche! Wir sind Deutsche! Don't shoot! Germans! We are Germans!" The patrols swung their weapons towards him. A sergeant shouted for the password. Frank hesitated. Password? What password? He had been gone for 8 days. Passwords changed daily. He had no idea. He shouted back, "Ich habe kein Kennwort. Ich bin Obergefreiter Franz Kopp, 487, Infanterieregiment, 8 Tage hinter Feindlinien. Ich habe 31 befreite Kameraden bei mir. I don't have a password. I am Lance Corporal Frank Kopp, 407th Infantry Regiment, 8 days behind enemy lines. I have 31 liberated comrades with me." The sergeant hesitated. Then he shouted a test question. "Wie viele Patronen im Kar 98K magazine? How many rounds in a Kar 98K magazine?" Every German soldier knew the answer. Frank shouted, "5! 5! The sergeant nodded and ordered, "Komm raus, langsam, Hände sichtbar. Come out slowly, hands visible." Frank walked into the clearing. Behind him came the 31 liberated soldiers, all with their hands raised. The reconnaissance patrol lowered their weapons. The sergeant walked up to Frank, scanned him from head to toe, saw the dirt, the blood, the exhaustion. The sergeant asked quietly, "8 Tage? 8 days?" Frank nodded. 8 days. The sergeant whistled softly through his teeth. Then he turned to his men and ordered, "Gebt diesen Kameraden Wasser, Essen, alles was wir haben, jetzt. Give these comrades water, food, everything we have, now." The patrol sprang into action. Canteens were handed out. Pieces of bread, canned goods. The 31 liberated soldiers drank and ate like starving men. Frank took a piece of bread, bit into it. It tasted like heaven. The sergeant sat down next to him and asked, "Du hast sie alle rausgeholt? You got them all out?" Frank shook his head and replied, "Nicht alle. 4 Kameraden starben. In den ersten Stunden. Not all. 4 comrades died. In the first hours." The sergeant put a hand on Frank's shoulder and said, "Du hast getan, was möglich war. Mehr kann kein Mann tun. You did what was possible. No man can do more." Frank said nothing. In his head, he still saw them. Private William Schmidt, torn apart by Soviet bullets. Martin Hoffman, who fell with him. Medic Paul Dietrich, ripped apart by a mine. Non-commissioned officer Hans Berger, sinking in the black water. 4 names, 4 faces. Frank would never forget them. The sergeant radioed the main line. 20 minutes later, trucks arrived. The 31 men were driven back to the main lines. Frank sat in the first truck, staring out the window, watching the forest whiz by. The same forest he'd been crawling through for 8 days. Now, free. He was free. At 7:15 p.m. on October 18, 1941, Lance Corporal Frank Kopp reached the German lines. After 8 days and 9 hours behind enemy lines. After 20 rounds of ammunition that had killed 13 enemy soldiers and saved 31 comrades. After 4 lost friends and an eternity in the woods, Frank was immediately taken to the division headquarters. A captain questioned him, wanting to know everything, every detail. Frank reported, mechanically, emotionlessly, the separation of the unit, the escape, the death of his comrades, the days in the forest, the Soviet field hospital, the young Soviet who hadn't betrayed him, the liberation of the prisoners. The captain took notes, asking precise questions. Then he leaned back and said, "Kopp, that was extraordinary. I'm going to recommend you for the Iron Cross First Class." Frank shook his head and replied, "No, Captain, I don't need a cross. I just want to sleep." The captain smiled sadly and replied, "I understand. Nevertheless, the report will go through." Frank saluted, was dismissed. A medic treated his wounds, the infected blisters, the cuts, the bruises, gave him clean clothes. Food, water. Frank slept for 19 hours. When he awoke, it was October 19th. Kyle Richards, the sergeant he had freed, was sitting by his bed. Kyle asked how he felt. Frank sat up and replied, "Better, alive." Kyle nodded and said, "We all owe you our lives, all 31 of us." Frank shook his head and replied, "You don't owe me anything. We're comrades. That's what we do." Kyle smiled and said, "Nevertheless, we won't forget this. Ever." He handed Frank something, a piece of paper. Kyle explained, "All 31 of us signed it. A testament, in case anyone ever asks what happened that night." Frank took the paper, read the names, 31 signatures, 31 lives. He folded it carefully, put it in his pocket and said quietly, "Thank you." Kyle Richards stood up, saluted. Frank saluted back. Then Kyle was gone, and Frank was alone with his thoughts. In the coming weeks, Frank Kopp's story spread through the Fourth Army, the sniper who survived 8 days and saved 31 comrades. Soldiers who didn't know him saluted him with respect. Officers nodded to him, but Frank didn't want attention. He just wanted to fight for his fallen comrades, for Germany, for the end of this war, so he could go home. On November 7th, 1941, Frank was indeed awarded the Iron Cross First Class. The ceremony was small, just his company. The commander pinned the cross on him, praised his courage, his resolve, his will to survive. Frank saluted, said nothing. What was he supposed to say? That he was lucky? That better men had died? That he saw their faces every night? Post-war analyses would describe Frank Kopp's survival strategy as a textbook example of sniper survival tactics, the avoidance of unnecessary confrontation, the conservation of ammunition, the psychological resilience, the precise target selection at the decisive moment. Military academies in Germany would later, decades after the war, teach his story, not as a heroic tale, but as a case study. How a single soldier with minimal resources can survive against overwhelming odds. But for Frank, it wasn't tactics. It was pure necessity. Every decision was born out of desperation, not strategy. Every survived day was a gift he hadn't deserved. The Fourth Army reached the outskirts of Moscow on December 2nd, 1941, just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, the closest point the Wehrmacht would ever reach. Then the Soviets launched their winter offensive. The German army was pushed back. Years of retreat followed, years of defeat. Frank Kopp fought through it all. Kursk in 1943, Bagration in 1944, the defense of East Prussia in 1945. He amassed 147 confirmed kills, was wounded 3 times. Received further awards, but none meant as much to him as those 31 signatures on the crumpled paper in his pocket. On May 8, 1945, the war ended. Frank was in American captivity, was released in October 1946, returned to the small town in Bavaria. Of the 31 men he had freed that night, 12 survived the war. Kyle Richards was one of them. They met in Munich in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, sat in a small pub, drank beer, talked about everything except the war. But at the end of the evening, as they said goodbye, Kyle said quietly, "You gave me a life I never expected. I got married, had 2 kids. That wouldn't have been possible without you." Frank shook his head and said, "You would have survived without me." Kyle smiled sadly and replied, "Maybe, maybe not. But I believe there's a reason you survived, why you were right there in that moment." Frank didn't answer. He didn't believe in fate, only in chance. But he didn't say that out loud. To be honest, the channel needs 1,000 subscribers to continue to grow. Currently we have 500. If you enjoy this detailed historical work, subscribe now. Every subscription brings us closer to more archival research and deeper documentation. Frank Kopp died in 1989 in the small town in Bavaria, 75 years old. A quiet death. No newspaper reports. No obituaries. His wife found an old yellowed piece of paper in his estate, 31 signatures. She didn't immediately understand what it meant, but then she also found his diary, the few pages he had written about those 8 days, and she understood. This paper was his most prized possession, more valuable than all the medals, more valuable than all the awards, because it represented 31 lives. 31 men who went home, who started families, had children, lived lives because of 20 rounds of ammunition and a sniper who refused to give up. The 31 signatures were later handed over to the Military History Museum in Dresden. They are on display there today. A small piece of paper in a glass case. Most visitors walk past without noticing it, but those who stop and read the story understand. This is not a document of war. It is a document of humanity. In the darkest of times, in the darkest of places, men found a way to be comrades, not for ideology, not for politics, but because it was the right thing to do. Frank Kopp would never claim to be a hero. He was a carpenter who became a soldier, a man who did what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. But for 31 men and their families, he was more than a hero. He was the reason they lived. Years later, in the 1960s, a Soviet veteran visited Germany. He was one of those who fled that night. He had seen Frank's shadow, heard the invisible death, 13 comrades lost in seconds. He said in an interview for a Russian history magazine, "We thought we were fighting an army. That night, we fought a ghost, a deadly ghost. I had no shame in fleeing. You don't fight ghosts. You survive them." This quote was later used in German military schools, not to glorify heroism, but to teach a lesson. A well-positioned sniper with limited ammunition can accomplish more than a company with unlimited resources. If he knows what he's doing, if he counts his shots, if every shot counts. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then support with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing the last remaining eyewitnesses. Frank Kopp's story is more than a survival story. It's a testament to the German soldier virtues that persisted even in the darkest moments: duty, honor, comradeship. These values weren't just words, they were actions embodied in a gaunt sniper with 20 rounds who refused to leave 31 comrades behind. The Soviet war diaries recorded the incident on October 18, 1941, as a mysterious attack by a German sniper. Casualties: 13 dead, several dozen fled, 31 prisoners escaped. No further details, no names. But history isn't just written in official documents. It's written in the hearts of those who were there, and in the lives of those who survived. Today, more than 80 years later, the descendants of those 31 men live all over Germany and the world. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, hundreds of people who only exist because a sniper on an October night in 1941 decided that 20 rounds were enough to risk everything, enough to attempt the impossible, and enough to actually achieve it. That's the true legacy of Lance Corporal Frank Kopp, not the medals and not the confirmed kills, but the lives, 31 lives that went on. Hundreds of descendants who will never know how close their existence was to never happening, a thin line between being and non-being, drawn with 20 rounds in a dark forest 80 years ago.